Are natural disasters happening more frequently than ever before? Or is it just me? It seems like every few weeks, a devastating event ravages another part of the world, whether here in North America or around the globe. This summer alone, we've witnessed the negative effects of wildfires in Spokane, earthquakes in Colombia, and typhoons across Asia. If you too have noticed more severe weather events lately, there's a reason. The World Meteorological Organization reports that weather, climate, and water-related disasters increased fivefold between 1970 and 2019. These extreme events come at a cost, both financial and emotional. They destroy structures, displace individuals and families, and in the worst cases, take lives. Now, many promo companies operate facilities in regions vulnerable to these catastrophic events. And unless your office is in a bunker 100 feet underground, your business is susceptible too, no matter where you live and work. So how can you prepare for the worst case scenario? And how can your business bounce back after disaster strikes? From Counselor Magazine, this is Promo Insider's Deep Dive, a podcast that takes an in-depth look at the trends, issues, and stories driving the promotional products industry. I'm your host, digital news editor Tara Lerman. Now it's almost September, which means the start of fall is finally upon us. I, for one, am looking forward to digging a few of my favorite dusty sweaters out of my closet in celebration of cooler temperatures. But September is also National Preparedness Month. That's an annual campaign from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA for short, encouraging businesses and communities to ensure they're ready for any disaster. The call to action, of course, is a timely one. There have been so many natural disasters this past summer, it's been nearly impossible to keep up with them all. But are there actually more catastrophic events happening, or have we simply gotten better at tracking them? Perhaps both things can be true. Of the 10 years with the most natural disasters, 9 have occurred over the last decade. That's according to the National Centers for Environmental Information, which says factors like population growth and climate change have contributed to this upward trend. And according to the Climate Central mid-2026 update report, $12 billion weather and climate-related disasters occurred in the U.S. alone between January and June 2026, and those resulted in at least $31.9 billion in damages and 183 fatalities. Now, population growth in vulnerable areas also increases exposure, while damage to buildings and infrastructure can make disasters more costly. NOAA, that's the federal agency that tracks and predicts weather conditions, notes that we could see the strongest El Niño conditions on record this year. Now, El Niño refers to a periodic warming of water in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific Ocean, and NOAA says it can impact global weather patterns for several months. But to effectively interpret this data, we also must recognize its potential flaws. Our World in Data is a collaboration between researchers at the University of Oxford and the nonprofit organization Global Change Data Lab. And they say no disaster database is perfect. Many datasets are incomplete, researchers say, and some events are unreported or hard to quantify. For instance, reporting biases can contribute to coverage of disasters in some areas, while others get left behind. And of course, we also have better tracking technology now than we've had in the past. Advanced satellite imaging and AI weather models have given us the tools to report on more weather-related disasters today than we could in recent history. And with breaking news and weather alerts hitting our devices instantly, not to mention the rise of social media, we are acutely aware of every event that's happening, both locally and around the world. We're more informed about international weather events and catastrophes than we've ever been. Which brings me back to promo. As an industry that relies on materials and parts from all over the world, many promo companies operate facilities and offices located in regions that are especially vulnerable to disasters. These businesses need a plan in place in the event that something beyond their control interrupts operations. Coming up, I speak with Crystal Ager, an Emmy Award-winning meteorologist with 20 years of weather and climate experience. She's also the co-founder of Monarch Weather Consulting. Our conversation after the break.
If you sell promo, you need more than Google searches and guesswork. You need the network, the tools, the data. You need the platform tens of thousands of distributors use to source products, find verified suppliers, and run their promo business with confidence. Whether you're brand new or scaling fast, ASI is where serious promo pros get their edge.
My name is Crystal Ager. I'm a meteorologist and founder of Monarch Weather and Climate Intelligence.
Well, Crystal, you have a bit of a unique professional background, right? You worked as a meteorologist and then you founded your own weather consulting firm. So talk me through what spurred that transition.
Yeah, well, I worked in broadcast meteorology for 18 years. It was a great run. I really enjoyed working my way around the country and bigger markets and covering every angle of weather imaginable. I spent some time at the Weather Channel, but the grind of weather news was really, taking its toll. I had children and I was ready for something different. I was waking up at 2 a.m. for the majority of those 18 years to get ready for a morning show. So I decided to look for something outside of TV broadcasting, and I was hired to be a weather and climate advisor for a global logistics company. And what happened is they had lost a facility. It was completely wiped out from Hurricane Maria, which was a Category 5 hurricane in Puerto Rico. That was back in 2017. And the risk manager said, I remember during my interview, he said something like, "We knew this hurricane was coming. We didn't know that was coming." They lost millions of dollars in inventory and realize that they need to have a better plan in place to mitigate weather and climate risk. And that's where the idea for Monarch was born. I saw a real need to support businesses. And, it really doesn't matter which industry you're in because weather doesn't discriminate. It touches all of us. And so 8 years in now, we've continued to grow in the business space.
We seem to be seeing more natural and weather related disasters than ever before. From your perspective as a meteorologist, why is that? And, can you talk me through kind of some of the data around that?
Sure. There are a few things happening. We're seeing an increase in the financial impact of these weather and climate disasters. We used to average $8-9 billion events in the 80s. Now we've more than doubled that. So you have more people, infrastructure, valuable assets and inventory in harm's way. That's one side of the story. And then we also have our changing climate. Our temperature across the globe has increased about 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit. That has significant impacts to how the atmosphere behaves. 10 of our warmest years on record have occurred since 2015. And that increase in heat is going to drive more weather extremes, whether it be heat waves or wildfires or rapidly intensifying hurricanes. So you have the exposure on one side and then the changing weather risk. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the different climate risks that businesses and individuals, what are they having to navigate as these disasters really grow in frequency?
Well, number one, it's really understanding how climate normals have shifted for your region. For example, Illinois is leading the charge with tornadoes this year. They've had, I think it's 460 now as of yesterday, tornado warnings. And, that's a trend that has changed since previous years. So understanding the risk for your area, whether it be wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, I think the extremes are changing depending on the region. But one thing I want to get across that's important to understand for businesses really is that it's not just a catastrophic event. It's not just a catastrophe you need to plan for with our changing climate. I have a great example of a story I was reading about a local coffee chain in Chicago. In the same week, they've seen impacts from wildfire smoke from the Canadian wildfires affecting one of their coffee locations. They also had water damage from a flood. And then, you have this huge music festival that takes place in Grant Park every summer. One of their downtown locations lost 40% in revenue because it was raining persistently. And so it affected foot traffic and ultimately revenue. So we're seeing a lot of impacts, whether it be extreme or, other related weather events that affect shipment and delivery and business operations in general.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think sometimes what makes the news is these big events, but a lot of times it's like maybe a little bit smaller events or like a few smaller events happening at once. So I think that's a good point that people forget about. Now, what would you say are some of the biggest mistakes or missteps that businesses make when they're navigating through these weather emergencies? I know you've worked with many businesses, so I'm curious what you've seen work and maybe what hasn't worked.
Sure. I think the biggest mistake is waiting until the weather is happening to prepare for it. You don't want to see a tornado warning issued for your location in St. Louis and then build a response plan. So a lot of businesses that come to us, that's essentially what they have been doing. They're being more reactive over proactive. So I would say making sure you are prepared and you have a plan and understanding how the weather affects your industry and your locations specifically. So some mistakes are relying on generalized forecasts. There's going to be severe weather in Texas later this afternoon. Well, what does that mean for your locations? How's that going to affect staffing? How's that going to affect, shipping? So I think the biggest mistake is just not having a plan in place. And I think businesses are realizing now more than ever how important it is, because weather touches nearly every aspect of your business, no matter what industry you're in.
Yeah. And what are your recommendations for how businesses can prepare for disasters, especially, in these areas that might be a little bit more prone to, say, tornadoes, wildfires, some of these other events that we've talked about?
I think it needs to go beyond watching the weather on television, for example. I did that for years. Our main goal is to protect the public, and focus on safety. For businesses, you need to have a weather intelligence plan. You need to understand, what your locations are up against or your shipping routes, for example. You're not going to get that from a television broadcast. At Monarch, for example, we have a platform we use. We overlay specific weather information with our clients' assets or transportation routes. We have custom alerts in place. So I highly recommend having some kind of alerting that is relevant to your location. And then you can also work with skilled experts, to help you understand, what you're up against. You can look at seasonal outlooks, for example, or have guidance during a catastrophic event where, a hurricane's making landfall and you need a weather company to help support you.
Well, Crystal, this has been really helpful, I think, for me and for our audience. Is there anything we missed that's important to this discussion, or any kind of final thoughts that you have?
I think a final thought as I was preparing for this conversation is just that, weather risk isn't only about safety anymore. I mean, safety is number one, but it's a business risk that we need to be aware of. We can't control the weather, but we can control the way we plan for it, right? And I mean, preparation is key. Having a plan in place is going to give you options, and options are extremely valuable when it comes to a big weather event, across, safety for your employees and customers, or just your operations and your bottom line in general. I think preparation is key.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tara, for having me.
As Crystal mentioned, businesses need to be concerned not just about where they're located, but also where their staff live and work, and how shipping routes may be impacted by inclement weather. That's especially true in promo, an industry that relies so heavily on getting goods from one point to another. Of course, some promo companies are smaller than others, so maybe they lack the resources required to adequately prepare for an extraordinary weather event. Experts like Dr. Chris Reynolds, a professor of emergency management at American Public University System, says there are other ways businesses can be prepared when disaster strikes.
my name's Dr. Chris Reynolds, and I'm a professor of emergency management at American Military University.
So, you're a professor of emergency management. What are some of the first things you teach your students about preparing for and navigating through, one of these weather crises or natural disasters?
Well, one of the first things that we teach, and one of the things that's paramount in our program at American Military University, is that of resilience. And, you can take that definition of resilience and really apply it anywhere in one's life. Whether it's resilience in your career, resilience with raising your family, resilience in school. In a disaster sense, community resilience is really the foundation of any successful area or community surviving a disaster. And we preach that and teach that continuously. And, it's not so much, preaching what you talk or acting what you talk, like, for example, most of our students are already practicing emergency managers. A lot of our students are active military. A lot of our students are, in emergency management trying to get, a promotion. They're trying to complete their degree, or they're not in it at all, but resilience plays not just in disaster response and preparedness, but it also pays back with the family. And I'll ask you, honestly, tell me, Tara, do you have a family emergency plan? Do you have a plan for you and your family should a disaster strike on where to go and what to do?
No, I don't.
That proves my point. And I'm not picking on you.
Yeah,
because what you're going to find is that is generally the answer that most people give.
Right.
Because really the only time you think or one thinks about a disaster and the impact of disaster is when it's happening. Then it's, oh my God, what am I going to do? So what we teach our students is that resilience path to say, well, yes, you're in your emergency management foundations course, but let's talk about what you're doing as a student, as a family member. Is your family prepared? Do you know where your evacuation centers are? Do you know what you need to have in your home to be resilient for up to 72 hours? So in case responders can't get to you, can you survive? So that's really a foundational element that we teach our students and we expect of them. And, we find that mouth to ear type of communication with respect to that really helps. And it helps them realize, wow, how can I be working in this career field, or how can I be encouraging the community to follow these precepts if myself, I'm not following them? So it's as much a personal belief as it is, hey, this is the concepts, this is how you do it.
Right. Now, I want to turn to talk about businesses for a bit, right? There's businesses and manufacturers that operate in places where natural disasters or emergencies might take place. So what's your advice for some of these companies, whether they be suppliers, distributors, any sort of company that maybe manufactures in places that are prone to disaster? What do you recommend?
Well, first of all, it's really important that the businesses understand their location. Okay. For example, a business that is maybe outside of Indianapolis, Indiana is going to be concerned about tornado season and severe thunderstorms. Businesses that are outside Houma, Louisiana, or outside Mobile, Alabama are going to be concerned about hurricanes. So a lot of their preparedness and planning is going to be based on that. So what's important for businesses to know is what hazards are their areas prone to receive. And I would encourage, business owners or, people that are in the management of these businesses to reach out to their local emergency operations center, their EOC, and talk to their emergency manager and ask them, hey, what do we need to be prepared for? And that not only helps that business understand what the hazards may be, but it also starts to build a relationship between the business and the community's emergency preparedness office. And that's important because in disaster, it's a push-pull. There may come an opportunity where the business requires assistance from emergency management, but there may also be an opportunity where emergency management needs assistance from the local business. Mm-hmm. And what that does is that not only builds resilience within the community, but it builds this public-private partnership, which any government, I can assure you, is looking to do. My time in government, that's what we spent our lot of time doing. My time in the military, there wasn't a place where we had a military installation or an Air Force base where we weren't tied directly into the community and assisting them in everything. And businesses are no different. So what really businesses need to do is, instead of investing in one person within the business to say, okay, Joe, or okay, Jill, You're responsible for our disaster plan. I want you to come up with a plan so we can continue operations in a disaster. Shift that emphasis. Instead of an individual, shift it to a disaster team, 3 or 4 people. So you then have depth. So if one person is out or 2 people are out, you've got depth in that can carry forward. Another thing that's important for businesses to do, in addition to knowing where they are in the country, is to have a functional emergency operations plan. Now, what I'm not talking about, Tara, is a book that's that thick. What I'm talking about is maybe 3 pages, 2 pages of information that are must know, need to action items. In other words, a storm's approaching. Where are we going to evacuate our items that, that are inventory that may risk being spoiled or contaminated? Where are we going to evacuate them to? Where are we going to import our data from our computer servers? Are we going to have a site that's within the community that's going to be struck, or are we going to move that at least 100 miles away where we know our data is safe?
Right.
What is our business continuity plan? What is our recall roster? Okay. Another really important thing for businesses, and this helps build employee morale, is to be sure that you have a, I am okay website or an I am okay button or a phone number where employees of the business can easily call in and check in and say, hey, I'm okay, family's fine, no worries here, because
Right.
that's equally important.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I know. On Facebook, they used to have that marked
Mhm.
safe from disaster. So having something at a company, it sounds like is equally important.
And that, Tara, honestly, that Facebook application is critical. That is
Mhm.
such a good system that Facebook has come up with. And,
Right.
we're in the age of social media, and most everyone's got a portable computer they hold in their hand every day in terms of a cell phone. And that's a great way to check in and let family members know you're safe and let business owners know you're safe.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Well, Dr. Reynolds, is there anything we missed that is important to this discussion, or any kind of final thoughts you have before I let you go?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I would urge the listeners and the viewers of our program this morning is to don't think about disaster preparedness and disaster planning when the disaster's happening. It's already too late.
Right.
We teach the 4 phases of emergency management: preparedness, mitigation, in response and recovery. You want to be leaning forward. You want to know, what season we're coming into. We want to know where the storms are. When I talked about El Nino, the fact that we need to remember is temperatures are increasing, urbanization is increasing. The fact that we have the potential for heavier and stronger storms is increasing.
Right.
Preparedness is the key. Teach it and preach it. It's critical. And leaders in these organizations and businesses need to be that change agent and lead. Lastly, maintain contact with your local emergency manager.
Great. Well, Dr. Reynolds, thanks so much for joining me today. This was really helpful. Now, it's one thing to prepare for a disaster, but cleaning up the damage and navigating the hardships after one happens is an entirely different challenge. When it comes to providing aid when disaster strikes, though, promo suppliers and distributors are often the ones stepping up to give back to those in need. For example, just last year, when flash floods swept through Texas, members of the promo industry launched a grassroots effort to ensure flood victims received essential items. Lawrence Hanley, the CEO of Austin, Texas-based supplier Desk Plants, joined up with Rusty Pepper of Taylor Corps, and together they created Team On Demand. It's a nonprofit organization that helps print and promo professionals give back during times of crisis. This summer, the organization mobilized distributors and suppliers to donate overruns, misprints, and inventory to victims of the earthquakes in Venezuela. They also just launched a relief campaign that will provide goods and support to those impacted by the Spokane wildfires. That page is now live on teamondemand.org, and I'll drop that link in the show notes for folks to check out. Others in the promo industry have found ways to lend a hand too. Zome Design's Braden Jessen was recently displaced from his home in Spokane due to the wildfires, but that hasn't stopped him from organizing a t-shirt fundraiser to help people throughout his community. Meanwhile, during Hurricane Melissa, a storm that caused tens of billions of dollars in damage, Deborah Lanigan of pro-forma distributor Mega Marketing Solutions joined forces with supplier partners to assemble and deliver care packages to people in Jamaica. ASI has also played a pivotal role over the years. We've raised over $2 million in disaster relief and charitable causes. Earlier this summer, Rusty Pepper told Counselor that the promo industry is actually uniquely positioned for disaster relief. That's because it's accustomed to operating high-speed and efficient logistics. After all, nothing says quick turnaround quite like a natural disaster. And many of the same goods that are popular in promo, say apparel and drinkware, for example, are highly sought after items during times of need. But these efforts are not effective without reliable supply chains and clear logistics frameworks.
You can have every well-intentioned mean to be a donor, but it can cause inefficient donations if you're not working together with, the right businesses, with the right logistics people to make sure that they can know how to do it and put it in place. So you have to establish those relationships and make sure that you each understand the roles and responsibilities that each person is bringing to the table.
That's Bailey Farrell. She's the VP of Project Management at AC Disaster Consulting, and she's coordinated rapid response supply chains that support continuity and disaster recovery. She's provided logistical support for public sector emergency management organizations, including but not limited to the Florida Division of Emergency Management, the Oregon Health Authority, and the New York City Office of Emergency Management.
Back in Hurricane Maria, there were pallets and pallets of water delivered to Puerto Rico with the best intentions, right? But it just sat in a field and wasn't distributed properly because it wasn't coordinated with the right people to make sure that it could be distributed and the logistics were in place to get to the right hands. So making sure that those connections are made beforehand, those roles and responsibilities are set. Nonprofits generally have better visibility into the affected communities. They know what's needed, where it's needed, but the businesses are going to be able to bring the capabilities and identify, the capacity to do so. So have those conversations. We know the players that are likely going to be involved. A lot of the times, there are contracts in place or those people are on the ground. So working together and establishing what does that response look like and prioritizing a demand-driven response rather than a donation-driven response has been something that I have found in previous experience has worked much better.
These relief efforts have become increasingly necessary as disasters grow in size and frequency. So how can more promo companies mobilize around disaster relief, and what are some best practices for doing so? Alicia Johnson is the founder of the emergency management and resilience consulting firm 2 Lynchpin Road. Her resume includes serving as Director of Emergency Management at UC Berkeley, advising NATO on resilience frameworks, and leading disaster response operations across the country. Not to mention, her work was also recognized by the Obama administration when he served in office. Here's my conversation with Alicia.
My name is Alicia Johnson. I'm the CEO of 2 Lynchpin Road, and my company works primarily with businesses and organizations across the United States to help prepare them for disaster.
Great. Well, as someone who does work with people on disaster relief, response, preparedness, what are some of the biggest mistakes and gaps that you've witnessed when it comes to natural disasters?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges we face is just admitting that bad things can happen to good people or good places, right? So just acknowledging that, hey, actually it happened in a community like ours and it can touch us too. And so being able to have those ready conversations about what's happening around us really helps serve that preparedness conversation in the longer term. Another thing that I think is really difficult to kind of a challenge, I guess, that we face is just not hyper focusing on one issue, right? One potential disaster, for example, like an earthquake or a wildfire, but knowing that our areas that we live in usually can be impacted by multiple things, often cascading one another, right? A wildfire can lead to a flood because of a burn scar and then heavy rains coming and a landslide happening. So there's lots of ways in order to be prepared that we have to think about the whole picture as holistically as possible, as opposed to just really focusing on one thing or making a broad assumption that it's never happened here before and so it won't happen here.
Yeah, that's a great point. Of course, there have been, a number of natural disasters recently. We've seen earthquakes in Venezuela. We've seen wildfires in Spokane. Are there, in fact, more natural disasters happening now than there have been in the past?
I think it's both. It's both. More disasters are happening and they're getting more attention. And some of that is as you mentioned, let's point to Spokane, that's still ongoing. That fire destroyed more than 900 structures and really was, by Western standards, very small, less than 10,000 acres at the time. And so that's not like a Sonoma Complex fire or a Hayman fire that were literally the largest in their state, and they're hundreds of thousands of acres by the time the fire is over. And even there are fires now happening in Washoe County, which is northern Nevada, up near Reno, up near Lake Tahoe, that are 50,000 acre plus, right? And not causing the level of structural damage that happened in Spokane. So not that they're not equally bad, they absolutely are, and they're having ecological impacts. And there's other elements of disaster response and preparedness that we need to be aware of. So there's multiple sides of that coin, but really understanding that it's not just the size that matters, it's also how destructive it is. And that's true not just with wildfires, that's true with every hazard, right? So size matters, the shape of the hazard, how much it's impacting a metro area versus a rural area, how much physical damage is happening, monetary damage, economic damage. Those are all long-term things that folks have to consider. Especially as business owners, right? You need to, and as local governments, think about the wide range of possible impacts to your area, to your neighborhood, to your community.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the reporting I've seen is kind of like how expensive was the damage, or like how expensive were different disasters. So I think that's an interesting point. Like there are different ways to measure it, and that some are larger technically than others, but if you think about like the different factors, the different impacts they have, how costly, like you said, how much human damage or structural damage, like that's all really interesting.
It's very easy to measure cost damage, right? But how much does it cost to recover in an area? Obviously, it's going to cost more to recover when multiple structures are damaged or destroyed. And yet there's another element, right? Like the ecological damage is often more difficult to quantify because we don't necessarily talk about the longer term impact to our ecology.
Right.
Then we talk about like the impact to local and small businesses in communities often is more difficult for them to recover than it is for a large chain like a Home Depot or a Walmart to recover. They could have a store temporarily closed and it doesn't affect their bottom line. A small business, you have a store temporarily closed and it's fully closed, right? It's not temporary anymore. So being able to understand that, I think, is a really key component of what disaster preparedness and capacity building looks like for your community and for your business as a whole.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about your work. When you're advising people and organizations impacted by these natural disasters, what does your process look like? How do you go about offering them recommendations?
Yeah, that's a great question. We typically sit down with them. We do a very in-depth stakeholder engagement process. So that could be talking to your disaster or emergency manager, talking to your CEO, your COO, talking to any kinds of outside stakeholders. Maybe those are people within your supply chain. Maybe they are customers that you work with regularly, and we kind of want to know what the impact would be downstream if an organization were impacted. In the case of a local government, it's very similar, right? We're talking to the decision makers, we're talking to the mid-level managers, stakeholders around them, non-governmental organizations that they engage with a lot. Often we talk to not just people within the org, but we talk to folks that are at the state and federal level as well. So looking at, other types of how those systems continue to work together. And then depending on the task at hand, maybe it's writing a plan, maybe it's looking at a threat analysis and trying to create, update that analysis and understand what is most likely to happen in those organizations. We can go into deeper foresight analysis. So looking at, hey, these types of things have happened in similar places. Here's some ways they may impact you down the road. We can do lots of in-depth stakeholder analysis, engagement, creating messages, things like that you might want to do with the folks that touch your organization on a regular basis. And of course, we've done a lot of exercises as well. So helping organizations and businesses build their continuity over time and understanding what that looks like if their organization is impacted by a crisis.
Yeah, I think the supply chain point is interesting because it's not just an organization or just a local government. Like often, it touches so many different parts of the business, right? So making sure that you're communicating, I'm sure is key.
Yeah.
So
we live in a place that's, we live in a world, not a place, a world that's very interconnected. And you never do see that more than in a crisis, right? When you're like, oh, wait, actually, that's happening really far away and it's making a big impact on my X, right? Whatever that is, on my supply chain, on those types of things. You saw that really early on with the war in Ukraine and the impact on hybrid vehicles because the rare earth minerals they needed to build hybrid batteries are mostly found in Ukraine. And so there were these issues where it was like, oh, wait, your hybrid vehicle is delayed because we are still struggling with a supply chain issue that honestly, those manufacturing businesses had no control over. And so just understanding that, okay, if we can't get it here, we have to do it this way. And you got to pivot, and crises require that of everyone.
Yeah, and sort of a twofold question for you, because I want to talk about preparedness, but also recovery and, what it looks like kind of after the crisis. So for companies that manufacture or operate a business in some of these places that are prone to crisis, how can they prepare for a disaster before it strikes? And then how should they respond really after it happens?
Yeah, I think one of the leading things you can do to prepare before an event occurs is to just be aware of what the potential risks are in your area. And, as we just talked about, potential risk to your supply chain as well. So kind of thinking about your business, not just within the four walls of your organization or your building, but like largely as a whole, what that looks like for the entire ecosystem that you operate in. Then I think the next step outside of just acknowledging that bad things happen and those bad things could look like A, B, C, and D is also having conversation with your employees and your stakeholders and letting them know, hey, by the way, we are acknowledging that this might happen. We may be impacted by a wildfire. If we are, here's the steps we want you to take. Take care of your family first. Ensure you are safe. And then you come, we would appreciate if you would return to your shift and do X, Y, and Z, or, whatever your plan is in relationship to that. Then, I think the third step is really to exercise that process, right? To walk the walk. You've talked about the potential hazard happening, and now you need to walk through what does that look like in your capacity, whether an employee is impacted or your organization and your building is impacted. What do those things look like? And the same is true for your stakeholders, your supply chain, all that type of thing. Then, you're never truly ready for an emergency because that's the nature of an emergency, right? It's something that you have thought about, but you just don't know when it's going to happen. So when it does happen, you have an idea of what's happening. You have an idea of you kind of rely on your gut instinct, your muscle memory to solve those problems. And you also know that, hey, we can't solve everything and we're going to have to rely on our ingenuity, on our insurance, on our ability to transform our capacity at any given point based on what we're seeing at the time. It doesn't even have to be a natural hazard. It could be a cyber attack. Right. You could be vulnerable to cyber and have to pivot at some point. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have to pivot your product line, but you may have to pivot the way you do things. You may have to relocate temporarily. You might have to deal with half staff because some of your folks are out because of evacuation or something like that. So there's lots of potential ways that crisis could affect your business. And also, I think one of the things that business owners, as a business owner and as a child of business owners, one of the things that's most important, I think, is how in touch you are with your community. Even if you don't necessarily produce products that your community directly uses, you are a part of that place and you are a part of that culture and a part of that organization, wherever that is. And so being able to understand that those folks are in need and how you can help them and be a part of that community, I think is really critical to your long-term recovery and to not only for your business, but for the place you've chosen to call home.
Well, Alicia, thanks so much for joining me today. This has been really helpful and really interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
That's all for this episode of Promo Insiders Deep Dive. Thanks as always to our viewers and listeners for tuning in, and be sure to check out the show notes for all the data and information we referenced in today's episode. I'm your host, Tara Lerman, and I'll see you next time.